History is full of empires that slowly faded away, but 3,000 years ago, the greatest civilizations on Earth didn't fade, they were decapitated. In less than 50 years, the map of the ancient world was wiped clean. Great cities were reduced to ash, and the survivors forgot how to read and write. It was the closest humanity has ever come to a total reset. As the palaces burned, the last scribes left us a warning. They spoke of a mysterious force rising from the waves. They didn't call them an army, they called them a conspiracy of islands, a terrifying coalition of warriors that appeared from the horizon, struck with brutal efficiency, and then vanished into the fog of time. For centuries, they were known only as the Sea Peoples. No homeland, no graves, no clear origin. Were they Viking-like raiders, desperate refugees fleeing a dying planet, or the world's first organized terrorists? Today, using the latest DNA evidence and lost archaeological records, we are finally putting a face to the phantom. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Sydney at breakfast and Lisbon at bedtime, all at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. Picture the shoreline just before dawn, somewhere on the eastern Mediterranean. You don't even need to know the exact city yet. The sea is dark, the air smells like salt and smoke from last night's cooking fires, and out there, way out, somebody spots shapes moving against the horizon. Sails. Not one or two, enough to make a watchman's throat go dry. And here's the thing. If you lived in this world around 1250 BCE, the scary part wasn't only the ships. The scary part was how much your entire life depended on the sea working the way it always had. Trade arriving on time, grain coming in from somewhere else, bronze getting made because the ingredients showed up, messages moving between kings like a kind of ancient email chain. This is where we start, because if we don't understand how surprisingly connected and organized the late Bronze Age was, then the collapse that follows just looks like barbarians attacked and everything burned. That's not the story. The story is a system, an impressive one, built so tightly that it became fragile. Think of it like a golden cage. Beautiful, expensive, and the bars are close enough together that once it starts bending, you can't just step out and improvise a new life. So, what does connected actually mean in 1250 BCE? It doesn't mean globalization the way we mean it. No stock markets, no container ships, no internet, but it does mean that the major powers of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were plugged into each other by regular, predictable routes. Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the city-states along the Levantine coast like Ugarit and Byblos, kingdoms like Cyprus, Alicia in many texts, and the Mycenaean world across the Aegean. These places exchanged goods, yes, but also exchanged people, expertise, status, even ideas about what it meant to be a real king. And the physical backbone of it all was bronze. We call it the Bronze Age because bronze was the high-performance material of the era. Bronze is stronger than pure copper. It holds an edge. It's workable. It's the stuff of tools, weapons, fittings, and status objects. But bronze has a problem. It's an alloy. You need copper and tin. And copper is fairly available around the region. Cyprus is famous for it. Parts of Anatolia have it. The Levant has access. Tin is the headache. Tin is scattered, far-flung, and precious. You can't just pick it up anywhere along the coast.
In practical terms, that means a Bronze Age palace economy had to maintain long-distance relationships. Somebody has to know where the tin comes from, how to secure it, how to transport it, and how to keep that pipeline from getting interrupted.
So when we say delicate system, we're not romanticizing. We're talking about a supply chain. And the late Bronze Age runs on supply chains in a way that feels weirdly modern. Now, I want to slow down on something that often gets lost in pop history versions of this era. People hear 1250 BCE, and they imagine a world of scattered villages and simple barter, like everyone is basically living in mud huts and occasionally trading a goat for a pot. That's not the picture here, not for the main actors. The big players lived in complex states with bureaucracies. They kept records, they levied taxes, they stored grain, they shipped diplomatic gifts, they built massive architecture. Egypt is the obvious example: monuments, temples, a professional scribal class, but it's not alone. The Hittites had an imperial administration. Ugarit had scribes writing in multiple languages and scripts, managing trade and correspondence. Mycenaean palaces, like the ones at Pylos and Knossos earlier, had their own administrative systems. This is a world where power is often palace-centered, which means a lot of the economy is not the free market. It's the palace deciding, collecting, redistributing, and rewarding. That works well when the palace is stable and the routes are open. It works less well when shocks hit and the palace suddenly can't deliver. Let me make this concrete. Imagine you're a skilled metal worker in a coastal city. You don't mine tin. You don't have a backyard copper deposit. What you have is a workshop, an apprenticeship, and a relationship directly or indirectly with the palace or local elites who supply you with raw material. They might pay you in grain, oil, textiles, housing, status. If the shipments slow down, you can't just pivot. You're not suddenly going to become a farmer on good land because the best land is controlled. You're not suddenly going to invent ironworking overnight because that transition takes time, knowledge, and resources. You're stuck in the golden cage, specialized, productive, and dependent. And that dependence isn't a moral failing. It's what makes the system impressive. Specialization is what allows large-scale building projects, complex weapon production, luxury goods. But specialization also means that when the network fails, the specialists get hit first and hard. It's not just metal, by the way. Luxury goods are a whole universe in the late Bronze Age. Think of ivory, glass, faience, gold, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, cedar wood, perfumes, dyed cloth. Purple dye is the classic example later, but the appetite for rare pigments and prestige materials is already there. These are not random trinkets, they're political technology. A king proves he's a king by giving gifts that look like kingship. Diplomacy in this era is often gift exchange with teeth behind it. You send something expensive not only because you're generous, but because you're signaling wealth, access, and stability. And it's reciprocal. When the system is humming, it creates this elite club of rulers who call each other brother in letters. Seriously, that's the language. And they marry into each other's families. They request doctors. They send craftsmen. They trade chariots and horses. They ask for gold. They complain when shipments are late. It's human. It's petty. It's political. And it's built on the assumption that the routes stay open, and the sea stays passable, and the harvests are good enough. So here's the big claim of this chapter. The late Bronze Age wasn't weak because it was primitive. It was vulnerable because it was advanced in a particular way. It had reached a point where many regions couldn't easily survive as isolated little islands anymore, not politically, not economically.
The system produced prosperity for elites and stability for states, but it also created tight coupling. In systems language, don't worry, we'll keep this friendly. Tight coupling means when one part breaks, the stress transfers immediately to other parts. There's no slack, there's no easy substitute. If tin shipments are delayed, bronze production suffers. If bronze production suffers, weapons and tools are impacted. If tools are impacted, agriculture and building slow down. If agriculture slows down during a bad climate stretch, people get hungry. Hungry people don't calmly wait for royal policy adjustments. They move, they riot, they raid, they join whoever is offering food and safety. So a small disruption can cascade, and because rulers are relying on the system to demonstrate legitimacy, feeding people, paying soldiers, rewarding officials, when they fail, their political base cracks. That's the golden cage again. It's not that the bars were weak metal, it's that they were shaped so precisely that a bend becomes a break. Another piece we need to underline, the Late Bronze Age is also a world of high-cost military systems. Chariots matter, not in every terrain, not in every battle, but as a symbol and as a battlefield tool, chariots are expensive. You need horses, you need trained teams, you need specialized craftsmen, you need roads or at least maintained routes, you need a warrior class or at least an officer corps. This pushes states towards centralization. It's not like you can just tell a bunch of farmers, hey, build a chariot division. So warfare itself becomes linked to the same networks: horse trade, wood supply, metal fittings, trained personnel. That means when the economy wobbles, the military wobbles too. And once the military wobbles, borders become porous. Coastal cities become nervous. Garrisons get pulled back to protect the core. And the periphery, places like trading towns, ports, smaller allies, start feeling abandoned, which matters a lot when danger shows up from the sea.
Now, I also want to say something that's easy to miss if we imagine ancient people as living in slow motion. They were information hungry. They cared about what was happening beyond the horizon. Kings used messengers, merchants traveled, sailors brought news, and there were shared expectations about the international order. If you're Egypt, you expect certain neighbors to behave in certain ways. If you're Ugarit, you expect help from allies or overlords, depending on your position. If you're the Hittites, you expect tribute, loyalty, stability in vassal territories. Those expectations are part of the system too, so when cracks appear, like a famine in one region or a rebellion in another, people aren't just dealing with the physical problem, they're dealing with the political shock of, wait, the world isn't behaving the way it's supposed to. And that psychological component matters, because confidence is a resource. A lot of states run on confidence. The palace has to look like it knows what it's doing, and once it looks uncertain, even for a moment, everybody starts making defensive choices, hoarding, refusing to pay, cutting deals, shifting loyalties, moving families inland, hiring extra guards, building walls. Defensive choices are rational individually, but they can accelerate the collapse of the wider system. If you've ever watched a bank run in a documentary, you get the idea. So let's pull our lens back for a second and do a quick map in the mind. The Eastern Mediterranean is like a set of linked zones. There's Egypt in the south, powerful, organized, dependent on the Nile, but also heavily invested in trade and diplomacy. There's the Levantine coast, ports, city-states, the middlemen of the sea, linking inland routes to maritime ones. There's Anatolia, the Hittite heartland, and its contested borders. There's Cyprus, sitting like a copper-rich engine in the middle of the sea. And there's the Aegean world, with Mycenaean palaces and seafaring communities. These areas have different languages, different gods, different politics. But they are not strangers. They are a connected neighborhood. And that neighborhood has a problem around the end of the 13th century BCE. It starts experiencing multiple stresses at once. We'll get into the climate piece next chapter, and I don't want to step on it too hard here, but just keep this in mind. If your entire economic and political world depends on good enough harvests, stable routes, and predictable alliances, then a long period of poor harvests and disruptions is not just a bad time, it's existential. And it's the kind of situation where people, real people, not cartoon villains, start moving in larger numbers. They start taking risks. They start attacking weaker points. They start doing desperate things. Which brings us, finally, to the phrase sea peoples. It's tempting to treat that phrase like it's a clean label, like Vikings or Mongols, one group with a unified identity. But even before we meet the names Sheridan, Peleset, and so on, we should understand what that label is doing. It's an Egyptian view from the shoreline, people arriving by sea, in groups, causing trouble, sometimes fighting, sometimes settling, sometimes showing up as mercenaries, sometimes as families on the move. From the point of view of a state like Egypt, it makes sense to lump them together. If you're trying to write a victory inscription, you want a category that makes the threat look big and your response look heroic. And you want it to look like order defeating chaos. That's how royal propaganda works. But from our point of view as historians, we should treat sea peoples more like a headline in a newspaper than a precise ethnic label. Like if a modern headline says, "Migrants arrived by boat," that tells you something real happened, but it doesn't tell you exactly who they are, why they left, what languages they speak, or whether they're one community or 20. Who were they is partly a question about identity, but it's also a question about what happens when a connected system fails and masses of people start moving through it. In other words, the ships on the horizon are the dramatic moment, but the stage was already set by the way this world worked. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the first cracks, how climate stress and hunger can undermine even a strong-looking international order, so that when those sails appear, we understand why the whole neighborhood suddenly feels like it's made of dry wood.
Let's start this chapter in a place that doesn't sound very cinematic. A tree. Not a royal inscription, not a burning city, just a tree growing somewhere in the uplands, year after year, doing what trees do. Because one of the weird gifts of modern science is that trees, lake mud, cave deposits, and even fossil pollen can act like silent witnesses. They don't tell us stories in sentences, but they do record stress. Wet years, dry years, long stretches where the rains don't show up the way they're supposed to. And if we're trying to understand why the late Bronze Age world started wobbling before the famous raids and battles, this is a big piece of it. The environment didn't exactly rebel, but it stopped cooperating. A lot of evidence points to a shift toward drier conditions across parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, with drought episodes that weren't just a bad season or two, more like a long, grinding instability, years of disappointing harvests punctuated by truly awful stretches. Now, I want to be careful here because climate history can get oversold. You'll sometimes hear a clean headline version. There was a 300-year drought, and that's why everything fell. Real life is usually messier. Different regions experience stress differently. Some years are fine. Some places have microclimates. Humans adapt in 1,000 ways. But the broad pattern that many researchers argue for is pretty straightforward. The end of the late Bronze Age lines up with a period of increasing aridity in a region that depends heavily on winter rains and predictable growing seasons. And when you pair that with a tightly coupled system, remember the golden cage, Food insecurity stops being a local problem. It becomes a political problem. It becomes a military problem. It becomes a migration problem. So what are the clues? One line of evidence comes from tree rings. In places where you can build long sequences of annual rings, basically a timeline of growth, narrow rings often indicate stress, commonly drought. The Eastern Mediterranean isn't as simple as, say, the American Southwest in terms of tree ring coverage, but there are studies that suggest notable dry phases around the time the system starts breaking. Another line of evidence comes from pollen. Pollen grains can survive for thousands of years in lake sediments. When scientists take cores, long cylinders of mud from lake beds, they can look at layers like pages in a book. And pollen tells you what kind of plants were thriving. If you see a shift from pollen associated with wetter, cultivated landscapes toward pollen from drought-tolerant shrubs and steppe plants, that suggests drying conditions and possibly agricultural contraction. Add to that evidence from cave formations, stalagmites and stalactites, which can preserve chemical signatures connected to rainfall patterns, and you begin to get a multi-source picture that, while not perfectly uniform, leans in the same direction, less reliable moisture over time. And here's the important part for our story. This wasn't happening to a society that had huge buffers. In many areas, farming was already a tough business. A couple of consecutive bad harvests can force families to sell livestock, abandon land, or fall into debt. Multiply that stress across regions, and suddenly you've got a landscape full of desperate decisions. It's easy to imagine ancient states as all-powerful, but they had limits. Grain storage helps, sure. Redistribution helps. Importing grain helps, but those tools assume someone else has grain to spare and that shipping lanes and political relationships are stable. And once multiple regions are stressed at the same time, the "somewhere else will cover us" logic collapses. This is where we start seeing hunger show up not as a poetic theme, but as a concrete driver. Hunger breaks routines. Hunger breaks loyalties. Hunger forces movement. If a coastal city is short on food, it will do what coastal cities have always done. It will try to buy it, demand it, or take it. If an inland region is starving, people drift toward river valleys, toward storehouses, toward places that still look like they have surplus. That movement can look like migration, or like raiding, or like both at once, depending on whose eyes you're looking through. Now put yourself in the head of a palace administrator. You're sitting in a place like Ugarit, or a Hittite provincial center, or even in the Egyptian sphere along the Levant. You're keeping records. You're tracking incoming tribute, outgoing shipments, the rations for workers, the supplies for soldiers. If harvests keep coming in short, you've got a problem you cannot solve with slogans. The army needs feeding. The labor force needs feeding. The craftsmen need feeding. The palace economy, which looks so impressive when it's working, is actually a giant hunger machine. It concentrates people and specialization, and it requires steady inflows. So the state begins to make choices that look rational but are politically dangerous. It raises demands on farmers, it requisitions grain, it tightens control. That creates resentment. It can spark internal unrest, or it can spark flight, people slipping away to places where the palace's reach is weaker. Meanwhile, elites try to protect their own stores first. And yes, this sounds familiar if you've ever read about any pre-modern famine, because humans are extremely consistent about what happens when food gets scarce. The other thing drought does, this is crucial, is it can weaken the military without a single battle. Horses need fodder, oxen need pasture. Grain is the basic fuel for logistics. If the state can't feed troops reliably, it can't keep them in the field. Garrisons get pulled back, patrols become less frequent, coastal defenses thin out. So you can have a coastline that looks quiet, but it's quietly underprotected. And the message travels. Sailors and traders notice when a port is poorly supplied, when soldiers look underpaid, when local rulers are nervous. Weakness has a smell. In that sense, environmental stress doesn't just cause hunger, it advertises opportunity to anyone who's mobile and armed. Also, and this matters for the Sea People's question later, drought doesn't only harm states, it harms small communities too. If you're a farming village in marginal land, on the edge of a plateau near scrub country, your margin for error is thin. A few dry years can push you off the land. You might move toward the coast, hoping for fishing and trade. You might move toward a richer valley, or you might join groups that are already moving. Over time, small movements can consolidate into larger ones, families traveling together, then villages, then whole communities. And once people are moving, they can become both victims and threats. A moving population has to eat. If they can't buy food, they take it. If local authorities resist, it turns violent. So from the receiving end, it looks like invasion. From the moving end, it looks like survival. Same event, different label. Here's another wrinkle. Drought doesn't have to be absolute to be disastrous. You can have normal rainfall on paper, but if it comes at the wrong time, late rains, storms that wash away seed, dry spells during key growth periods, you can still lose a crop. Agricultural societies need timing as much as quantity. So when we talk about climate stress, imagine not a cartoon desert spreading overnight, but a long period where the old rhythms become unreliable. Farmers can't plan, palaces can't plan, merchants can't plan. And planning is basically what holds this late Bronze Age world together. Now, do we see any human voices from this period that hint at famine and strain? We do, indirectly. Letters and administrative documents from the broader region include requests for grain, complaints about shortages, and signs that rulers were scrambling. Even when the surviving texts don't say, "We are in a climate crisis," they show the symptoms: urgent tone, emergency shipments, allies being asked for food, officials trying to manage scarcity. And it's worth saying out loud, no king likes to admit he can't feed his people. Royal ideology is built on provision. So the fact that we see so many hints of strain, even through the filter of palace paperwork, should make us take it seriously. If the elites are worried, the common people are already suffering. And once common people suffer, the stability of the whole political order becomes shaky. Because what is a state in this era, in practical terms? It's a promise that the palace can coordinate violence and food. It protects you, it taxes you, it provides for armies and workers, it maintains gods and rituals, it keeps the world in balance. When food runs short and protection weakens, the promise breaks. At that point, the palace can still build temples and write inscriptions, but it's becoming hollow. Now, here's where I want to connect climate and hunger back to the theme of vulnerability. In Chapter 1, we talked about how interconnected the system was. Climate stress is like someone quietly turning down the pressure in the pipes. Trade can compensate for a while, import grain, shift supplies, but only if shipping is safe and partners are stable. And that's where the feedback loop begins. Hunger increases unrest. Unrest weakens borders. Weak borders encourage raiding. Raiding disrupts trade. Disrupted trade makes hunger worse. It becomes a spiral. And in a spiral, you don't need a single cause, you just need enough stressors that the system can't dampen them anymore. Instead of absorbing shocks, it amplifies them. So by the time we get to the dramatic moments, ships appearing, cities burning, those aren't the first blows. They're the blows that land on a body already weakened. One more thing, because people sometimes ask, if it was drought, why didn't everyone just adjust? Humans do adjust all the time. They change crops, they change planting schedules, they irrigate where possible, they store more grain in good years, they diversify. But adaptation has limits, and those limits are social as much as environmental. If land and water are controlled by elites, small farmers can't just decide to build irrigation. If the palace is demanding taxes in grain, you can't simply keep more for your family. If the military is requisitioning animals, you can't keep your oxen for plowing. Adaptation is easier when society is flexible. The Late Bronze Age, for all its sophistication, is not flexible in that way. It's hierarchical, it's centralized, it's dependent on the palace, which means it can respond fast in some ways, mobilize, order shipments, but it can also respond brutally, and brutality often backfires. People flee, people resist, people join outsiders, people stop believing in the system. So when you hear the environment rebelled, what we really mean is this: the underlying conditions that made the Late Bronze Age prosperous became unstable, and the political structures in place were not built to handle long, multi-decade stress without cracking. And that sets the stage for the next chapter, where we start talking about names: Sheridan, Shekelesh, Luka, Peleset, and the Egyptian framing of sea peoples. Because when those groups show up in the record, they're not arriving in a world at full strength. They're arriving in a world already hungry, already tense, already making desperate moves. In other words, the sails on the horizon aren't the beginning of the story. They're what happens when a weakened, tightly connected world finally meets a wave of human movement that it can't absorb.
Okay, so now we finally meet the so-called sea peoples up close. And the first thing I want to do is slightly annoy everyone who loves clean categories. Sea peoples is not a self-introduction. It's not like a group showed up and said, "Hi, we're the Sea Peoples, here's our flag." It's a label that comes mainly from Egyptian sources, written in the language of royal power, meant to explain chaos and then claim victory over it. And that matters because it shapes everything we think we're seeing. The Egyptians had a habit, like every empire, honestly, of grouping outsiders into big, convenient boxes. Sometimes that box is accurate, sometimes it's propaganda, sometimes it's just shorthand. So when you hear sea peoples, think a cluster of different groups arriving by sea, not a single nation. And the best evidence we have for the names of these groups comes from Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs, especially from the reigns of Merneptah and later Ramesses III, where the Egyptians list foreign enemies as if they're naming the villains in the credits. The names that keep showing up in popular discussions are Sheridan, Shekelesh, Luka, and Peleset, plus a few others that appear in the same orbit depending on which text you're reading. But let's stick with the set you've chosen, because they're a good window into the bigger problem. We can name them, but naming them doesn't automatically tell us exactly who they were, where they came from, or why they were moving. So, Sheridan first. This is one of the most intriguing names because the Sheridan seem to show up in more than one role. In Egyptian sources, they're sometimes enemies, but they're also sometimes mercenaries serving Egypt. That's a huge clue. It tells you these weren't just faceless raiders who appeared out of nowhere in one dramatic moment. Some of these groups, or at least some men from these groups, were already part of the Mediterranean military job market.
If you're a pharaoh and you can hire tough foreign fighters, you do it. If you're a foreign fighter and your home region is unstable, getting paid by Egypt is a pretty attractive option. That's why you see shirden associated with Egyptian military service in some contexts and as opponents in others. It's messy, but the mess is the point. Now, people often connect the shirden to Sardinia because the name sounds similar, and there are some broad cultural parallels people like to point to, but I'm going to keep that in the category of possible rather than settled. Similarity in names can be suggestive, but it's not a signed passport. What we can say more confidently is that Egyptians recognized them as a distinct group worth naming, and that they were integrated enough into the world that they could end up on either side of a battle line. Next, the Shekelesh. There's a long-running idea that the Shekelesh might connect to Sicily because of the way the names line up, and because Sicily sits right in the central Mediterranean, where a lot of movement could funnel through. Again, it's tempting, and it might even be right, but we have to handle it like historians, not like people doing word puzzles. The hard truth is that Egyptian scribes were writing foreign names in Egyptian, filtered through Egyptian ears, and we're reconstructing them through modern scholarship. That's a lot of translation layers. So what do we do with Shekelesh? We treat it as a named group in Egyptian records, likely one component of a wider set of migrating or raiding communities, possibly with roots somewhere in the broader Aegean, central Mediterranean sphere, but not pinned down to a single island with certainty. Then there's Luca. This one is a little easier to anchor geographically because Luca lines up pretty well with a region in southwestern Anatolia, often associated with Lycia in later Greek usage. And here the broader context helps. Anatolia is Hittite territory and contested borderland territory at the same time. The western and southwestern edges are full of seafaring communities, mountain valleys, small polities, and people who can disappear inland or launch out to sea depending on pressure. Egyptian sources naming Luca make sense in a world where the Anatolian coast is a zone of both trade and trouble. If the Hittite system is weakening, those coastal and near-coastal groups may become more mobile, more predatory, or just more desperate. And the last of the four you listed, Peleset. This is the one that most people lock onto because Peleset is commonly connected to the Philistines of later biblical tradition. That connection is widely argued for, and it's a major bridge between Egyptian inscriptions and the later Iron Age world of the southern Levant. But even here, we want to be careful about what we mean. Peleset in Egyptian texts seems to refer to a people who end up, at least in part, settling in coastal Canaan. That doesn't mean every person labeled Peleset came from one single homeland, and it doesn't mean they were the only ingredient in what later becomes Philistine culture. Cultures form through mixing. What we can say is that Peleset shows up as a distinct named group in Egyptian sources around the crisis period, and later we see a new cultural package appear in parts of the southern Levant that looks like it has Aegean connections. That's the bridge. The bridge is not a perfect straight line, but it's there. Now, the fun part, and also the dangerous part, is the visuals. When people talk about the Sea Peoples, they often picture the famous helmets and costumes, feathered headdresses, horned helmets, round shields, long swords, short tunics. And those images mostly come from Egyptian relief art, especially the big narrative scenes that show battles and captives. And yes, those details are real in the sense that they were carved by artists who meant to depict recognizable foreigners. But we should always remember, this is Egyptian state art. This is not a neutral documentary photograph. It's a staged visual language. Egyptian artists used conventions, They exaggerated, they standardized, they made the enemy look like the enemy. Sometimes they clearly differentiate groups by gear and hairstyle. Sometimes they compress distinctions to fit the story.
So when you see, for example, horned helmets associated with certain groups like the Shurden, in many reconstructions, the responsible way to say it is, Egyptian art depicts some foreign warriors with horned helmets and distinctive round shields, and scholars often associate that with Shurden. But we are interpreting a visual code, not reading a museum label attached by the person wearing the helmet. Same with feathered headdresses. They're striking, they stand out, and they may reflect real headgear or symbolic markers. But they also serve a narrative purpose. They make these people look visually foreign in a way any audience could instantly recognize. That's how you tell a story on a temple wall. Still, the equipment does tell us something important. These were not random peasants with sticks. The people depicted are armed in an organized way. They have standardized-looking shields. They have swords that resemble weapons used across the Mediterranean. They have spears or javelins. And in some scenes, you see something else that's very hard to ignore. Ox-drawn carts carrying household goods, women, children. That's not a pure raiding party. That's movement with families. And that's why the Sea Peoples question keeps flipping back and forth between invaders and migrants, because the sources show both faces at once. You can absolutely have armed men fighting while their families travel behind them. In fact, that's one of the most historically common patterns in large-scale migration under pressure. Now, let's talk about the phrase that sometimes gets quoted from Egyptian texts, a conspiracy, or they made a conspiracy in their islands. People love that line because it sounds like a thriller, like a secret meeting of pirate kings planning to end civilization. But when you read it as a political statement, it's doing something very specific. It frames the enemy as coordinated, intentional, and aggressive, which makes Egypt's victory look more necessary and more heroic. It also makes the collapse of other states sound like the result of an external plot, not a sign that the international order itself was failing. That's convenient for Egypt. It's also psychologically satisfying for any society under stress. It's easier to believe there's one enemy with a plan than a messy pile of drought, hunger, rebellions, and cascading logistics failures. So I don't dismiss the Egyptian claim. Something real happened. Multiple groups moved, some coordinated, at least temporarily. But I also don't take conspiracy as a literal boardroom meeting on an island. It's the language of royal explanation. And that's the big takeaway of this chapter. We have names, we have images, we have labels, but all of it comes through the filter of an empire defending itself and selling a story about order triumphing over chaos. The Sea Peoples in the Egyptian record are both real and rhetorical. Real because there were ships, battles, captives, disruptions. Rhetorical because the way Egyptians organized that information served Egyptian politics and Egyptian ideology. So when we list Shurden, Shekelesh, Luka, and Peleset, we're doing something useful. We're breaking the threat back into components, but we're also admitting the limits of our knowledge. We're listening to one side of the conversation, carved in stone by the winners, about groups who often didn't leave us readable texts of their own. And that brings us to the next step in the story. What happens when those movements and raids intersect with specific states that should have been able to handle them, like the Hittite Empire, a major military power? Because if the Hittite Empire, a major military power, can be brought down in this period, then we're not looking at a minor piracy problem. We're looking at a regional transformation that's big enough to change the map. So let's shift our camera north for a minute, away from Egypt's temple walls and down the Nile confidence, and into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where the Hittite Empire had been one of the heavyweights of the late Bronze Age world. If Egypt was the old, steady superpower with a long tradition of centralized rule, the Hittites were the other pole of the system, a militarized, diplomatic, treaty-writing empire that could go toe-to-toe with Egypt and not blink. These are the people who fought Egypt at Kadesh centuries earlier, signed a famous peace treaty, and maintained a network of vassals and allies across a rough, complicated landscape. In other words, the Hittites are not supposed to just collapse, not quickly, not violently, not in a way that leaves their capital abandoned and burned. And yet, that's what seems to happen. Their capital, Hattusha, goes down, and the empire as a unified state basically disappears from the historical record. So the question is, how does a lion fall? And the frustrating answer, the honest answer, is that we don't have a single smoking gun. We have a cluster of problems that hit an already stressed system. We have hints in texts, we have archaeological destruction layers, we have the geography of the place, and we have the wider regional collapse happening at the same time. The Hittite fall is one of those events where every piece we touch is part of the story, but no single piece is the entire story. First, let's talk about what the Hittite Empire actually was, because it's easy to flatten them into some Anatolian kingdom. They weren't small. Hattusa was a major capital with huge walls, gates, temples, administrative buildings, archives of clay tablets. The Hittite state was literate and bureaucratic. They managed treaties, tribute, royal correspondence, and a complex internal structure. And crucially, they sat on a strategic crossroads. Anatolia links the Aegean world to the Near East. It's the land bridge between zones. It's also a place with mountains, plateaus, choke points, and long internal distances. That geography shapes your politics. To hold Anatolia together, you need roads, garrisons, loyal local elites, and enough food moving to keep soldiers and administrators in place. When things are stable, it works. When things get unstable, it becomes a nightmare. Because if one region breaks away, the next one is suddenly exposed. And if the center can't project power fast, the periphery starts making its own decisions. So here's the first big point. The Hittites were strong, but they were stretched. The empire depended on maintaining control over vassal states and border regions. It also depended on access to key resources and trade routes, including routes that connected them to the Levantine coast. And that's where the trouble starts to feel familiar. If climate stress and harvest failures are affecting the wider region, the Hittite heartland isn't immune. Food shortages in a centralized state are political poison. The palace needs grain, the army needs grain, the cities need grain. And Anatolia, especially the central plateau, can be vulnerable to drought. If yields drop, the state's ability to maintain its network drops with it. Now, Hittite texts from the late period include hints of strain, requests for grain, concerns about supplies, problems that sound like logistical stress. Again, states don't like admitting weakness, so the fact that we get even indirect signs is telling. A second point is internal politics. Big empires have internal problems even when the weather is fine. Succession disputes, rival branches of the royal family, provincial leaders testing boundaries. And we have evidence that the late Hittite period saw political tension and instability. A state can look strong right up until the moment it isn't. And when resources shrink because of bad harvests, because trade routes are disrupted, those internal tensions become sharper. Think of it like a family business under financial stress. When money is flowing, people smile and compromise. When money stops flowing, every old argument comes back with knives out. A third point is external pressure, and this is where the Sea Peoples question brushes up against the Hittites in a way that's tricky.
The Hittite Empire is not a coastal power in the same way Egypt is, but it has coastlines and it has coastal vassals. Western Anatolia and the Aegean-facing side are exactly the kind of zone where maritime raiding and migration could cause real disruption. If ports are attacked, if coastal cities fall, if shipping becomes dangerous, the Hittite state loses access to goods, communications, and perhaps mercenary labor. And it loses the ability to respond quickly to problems in the south, like in Syria and the Levant, where the Hittites had important interests. If those regions start slipping, the empire's southern wing weakens. So it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the Hittites are being hit on multiple fronts: food stress at home, political stress in the palace, and security stress along their edges. And then there's the human geography of Anatolia itself. This is a land of many communities, some integrated into the Hittite system, some resisting it, some living in mountainous areas where state control is always partial. If the center weakens, local groups can rise, rebellions become more likely, banditry increases. And when outside groups move through, whether Sea Peoples groups, displaced communities, or opportunistic raiders, they can ally with local enemies of the state. Empires often fall not just because an external enemy is powerful, but because internal fragments decide the empire isn't worth supporting anymore. Now, what about Hattusa itself? Archaeologically, the story is dramatic. The city's end involves destruction and abandonment. The archives, the temples, the palaces. This is not a gentle administrative transition where someone changes flags and keeps the bureaucracy running. The capital is effectively left behind. And that's huge. Capitals don't get abandoned unless the state is gone or the state is fleeing. So the fall of Hattusa is less like a city was sacked and more like the central machine stopped functioning. It's also worth noting that not every site shows the same destruction story. Some places burn, some are abandoned, some continue in altered forms. That's another reason historians talk about a collapse process rather than a single apocalypse moment. The phrase Bronze Age collapse covers a broad, uneven transformation. But Hattusa is a clear marker. When that center goes quiet, something fundamental has changed. So who brought the lion down? People often want to point a finger. It was the Sea Peoples, or it was earthquakes, or it was drought, or it was internal revolt. The best answer is that the Hittite Empire was vulnerable to a combination. Sea-based disruption could weaken their southern connections. Drought and hunger could undermine their internal stability. Political infighting could paralyze decision-making. Local revolts could break the chain of control. And once the chain breaks, the empire can unravel with shocking speed. There's a line I like to use when I teach collapse. Strong systems can fail fast when their strength depends on coordination. The Hittite Empire wasn't just a pile of warriors, it was coordination between provinces, between vassals, between officials, between supply routes. If you interrupt coordination, the lion doesn't die in a heroic duel. It dies because it can't breathe. And that might be what it felt like to people living through it. Not one clear enemy, but a world becoming unmanageable. Here's the haunting part. When the Hittites fall, the map doesn't just lose a state, it loses a stabilizer. The Hittites had been one of the pillars holding up the late Bronze Age order. They were the counterweight to Egypt. They were the big treaty maker. They were the empire that could police parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. When that pillar goes, everything south of it becomes more exposed. Cities that relied on Hittite protection, trade, or political structure are suddenly on their own. And on their own in a time of hunger and maritime disruption is terrifying. Which sets us up perfectly for the next chapter, where we zoom in to one of those coastal cities that sat at the intersection of trade, diplomacy, and danger, Ugarit. Because if Hattusa is the story of a superpower collapsing, Ugarit is the story of a smaller but incredibly connected city, writing what might be the most chilling "we're about to die" message from the ancient world.
Let me take you to a desk. Not a throne room, not a battlefield, just a working desk in a coastal city where scribes are doing what scribes always do, pressing styluses into damp clay, keeping the paperwork of a whole world moving. The city is Ugarit on the Syrian coast, and in the late Bronze Age, it's basically a hub, a port, a marketplace, a diplomatic switchboard. Ships come and go, merchants speak multiple languages, the palace corresponds with bigger powers. Ugarit is the kind of place that makes an interconnected world possible. And that's exactly why its final days hit so hard, because in the ruins, archaeologists found something that feels uncomfortably modern. An urgent message from a ruler saying in plain terms, "The enemy is here, and we're not ready." This is where the Bronze Age apocalypse stops being an abstract collapse and turns into a human moment with a timestamp. The famous text people talk about is a clay tablet letter, one of several from the city's last phase, where the king is essentially pleading that hostile ships have appeared and his forces are away. There are different tablets and translations involved in the wider Ugarit was under attack dossier, but the core situation is consistent. Ugarit is facing a maritime threat, and it's scrambling. And the detail that makes everyone's skin crawl the first time they hear it is that one of these letters was found in a kiln, like it was being dried or prepared, and never sent. The city didn't get the chance. It's the ancient equivalent of an email sitting in an outbox when the power goes out and the building catches fire. So who was the king of Ugarit writing to? Likely a larger patron or ally. Ugarit sat in a web of obligations, sometimes under Hittite influence, sometimes balancing relationships with other powers. The point isn't just the recipient. The point is the panic. Ugarit is a port city. It knows the sea. It knows ships. If Ugarit is alarmed by ships, these aren't normal traders rolling in late. Something is wrong. And the king's complaint that "my troops are away" is equally revealing. This tells us about how thin the margin of safety had become. In a stable world, you don't send all your troops away when you're a coastal target. In a stressed world, you do, because you're putting out fires everywhere at once. Maybe troops were sent inland to deal with unrest. Maybe they were assisting an ally. Maybe they were guarding grain shipments. The details can be debated, but the general picture is sharp. Resources are stretched, threats are multiple, and the state has to gamble. And Ugarit's gamble fails. Now, to understand why this letter matters so much, you have to understand what Ugarit represents. This is not a backwater fishing village. Ugarit was cosmopolitan. It used writing systems that show a sophisticated bureaucratic and cultural environment. It traded across the Mediterranean. It handled luxury goods. It dealt with large states. It's part of the late Bronze Age international-style world, where elites share tastes and diplomatic habits. So, if Ugarit is being hit, and hit hard, the disruption is not local. It's a sign that the routes are no longer safe, and the political guarantees behind those routes are no longer functioning. It's like if you heard that a major modern port city had lost control of its harbor and couldn't call in help.
You would immediately infer that the bigger security architecture is failing. The letter also gives us something else: timing. One of the hardest things about the Bronze Age collapse is that it's not a single year. It's not one apocalypse day. It's a wave of destruction and abandonment that rolls unevenly across decades. But Ugarit's end feels like it comes fast. The city is destroyed and not rebuilt in the same way. The archives are left, the buildings burn, life stops. That kind of sudden stop is a gift for historians because it preserves a snapshot. When a site is abandoned quickly, the stuff stays where it fell. In Ugarit, that means tablets left in place, administrative records frozen in time, and among them, letters that show an elite trying to manage a crisis in real time. So let's slow down and imagine the situation inside the palace. The king receives reports, ships have been seen, coastal watchposts are nervous, merchants are not coming in, or they're coming in with horror stories from other ports. Maybe refugees are arriving, maybe there are already small raids happening along the coast, hit-and-run attacks that test defenses. The palace has limited options. It can send messengers for help, it can try to recall troops, it can fortify the harbor, it can ration supplies. But if the threat is immediate and the garrison is missing, you are basically praying for time you don't have. And this is where the broader system collapse becomes very tangible. In the old days, meaning the earlier Late Bronze Age, Ugarit could expect some degree of protection from the regional order. If it was a vassal of a large power, that power had an interest in keeping the port alive. If it was part of a treaty network, allies might respond. But if the Hittite state is collapsing, if coastal routes are unsafe, if other cities are also under threat, then the help doesn't come. The letter is partly a request and partly an accusation. Where is the support that the system promised me? And the silence that follows, because the letter never goes out or because no answer arrives, tells you the promise is broken. There's another aspect here that's worth mentioning, because it's easy to imagine attackers as a clean military force with a clear identity. The problem is, even if some of the attackers are what Egyptians would later call sea peoples, they're operating in a world already full of movement. Pirates, displaced communities, mercenaries switching sides, coastal warlords, hungry bands traveling with families. It's possible that what hit Ugarit was not one uniform nation, but a coalition or a wave of raiders traveling along a corridor of weakened ports. And in that scenario, Ugarit is not chosen because it's politically symbolic, it's chosen because it's rich and exposed. Ugarit has warehouses, Ugarit has food stores, Ugarit has metals and textiles, Ugarit has ships. In times of scarcity, ports become targets. So the letter is a window not only into fear, but into the logic of violence in a hungry world. People attack what can feed them and what can pay them. That's not a moral judgment, it's a pattern. Now, remember that dramatic detail about the kiln? Clay tablets are durable if they're baked. Many tablets survive because buildings burned and accidentally fired them, preserving them. That's the dark irony of archaeology. Destruction can preserve evidence. The tablet found in a kiln suggests it was in the process of being prepared, maybe for sending, maybe for archiving, and then the crisis cut it off mid-step. It's one of those details that makes the past feel close. You can almost see the scribe thinking, okay, let me get this ready, and then hearing shouting or running feet or the sound of something breaking. And again, this is why I like using Ugarit in a lecture. It's not just grand narrative, it's human scale, it's bureaucracy and panic. It's a city that depended on connections, discovering that connections can fail. So what happens next? Ugarit is destroyed, and in the aftermath, the world it belonged to is basically gone. The trade networks that made it rich shrink or break. The palatial system that supported scribes and international correspondence collapses in many places. And the surviving powers, especially Egypt, are suddenly dealing with threats not as distant trouble, but as direct pressure on their borders. Which takes us to the next chapter, the big cinematic one, the fight in the Nile Delta under Ramesses III, where Egyptian sources claim they stopped this maritime wave. Whether that was a clean victory or a temporary halt is something we'll talk about, but it's definitely the moment where the Sea People's story reaches its most famous scene.
All right, if chapter before was the quiet horror story, one letter, one city, a desk in a panic, this chapter is the big, loud set piece, the one with carved battle scenes and a ruler basically yelling to history, "I stopped this, I saved the world, remember my name." We're in Egypt now, in the reign of Ramesses III, and what most people call the Battle of the Delta is where the Sea People's story hits its most famous, most visual moment. Because Egypt didn't just write about it, they put it on the walls at Medinet Habu like a giant illustrated press release. And I'm going to use that phrase on purpose, because Egyptian royal inscriptions are never just reporting, they're always arguing. They're selling you a version of reality where Egypt is order, Pharaoh is the center of the universe, and the enemies are chaos pouring in from outside. But here's the thing, propaganda usually doesn't bother inventing a threat out of thin air. You carve this kind of thing in stone when you are genuinely scared, when you're spending real resources on defense, and when you need people, your officials, your army, your temples, your subjects, to believe the state is still strong. So what exactly is happening? The basic Egyptian claim is that a coalition of seaborne groups, people with families, carts, and a plan to settle, pushed into the eastern Mediterranean and then turned toward Egypt, hitting by land and by sea. Egypt frames it as a kind of world-ending migration, whole peoples on the move, cities falling, and finally the wave reaches the Nile. Now, is that phrasing a little theatrical? Yes. Is it also consistent with what we see elsewhere? Ruined coastal cities, disrupted trade, pressure along borders? Also yes. So let's treat the Egyptian account like we should treat any state narrative, with skepticism about the self-congratulation, but respect for the fact that it's describing a real crisis. The Nile Delta, by the way, is a very particular battlefield. If you haven't pictured it, do this. Imagine the Nile splitting into multiple branches as it approaches the Mediterranean, creating a fan of waterways, marshes, narrow channels, and shifting edges of land. It's not open ocean, and it's not dry land in the normal sense either. It's a maze. And in a maze, ships don't have a lot of freedom. You can't just spread out and maneuver the way you can on the open sea. You get funneled, you get stuck, you get predictable. Which is exactly what you don't want if you're sailing into a defended river system. This is where Egypt's strategy, at least the strategy Egypt claims, makes a lot of sense. The Egyptians depict themselves essentially setting a trap, let the enemy ships enter the channels, then hit them with massed archers from the banks and from Egyptian boats positioned to block or ram. And if you've ever watched how even a modern boat handles in a narrow channel under stress, turning radius, momentum, the panic of collision, you can imagine the ancient version being brutal. You don't need Hollywood fireballs. Confusion, crowding, ships bumping and tangling, people falling overboard, and then arrows raining down into a packed target. Egyptian archery is a big deal in their own military identity. They love showing Pharaoh as the master archer, the one who can shoot through the enemy as if the bow is an extension of divine will. And yes, that's ideology, but archers also make practical sense here. Against ships confined in narrow water, archers are devastating. You're basically turning the riverbank into a firing platform. Also,
let's talk about something that's easy to miss. Egypt's advantage isn't only weapons, it's familiarity with the terrain. It's fighting in your own backyard, with supply lines behind you, with local knowledge, with prepared positions, maybe even with pre-planned defenses. If you're the attacking coalition, you're coming in with momentum, with desperation, with courage, maybe with numbers. But you're also entering a landscape that's designed to chew up outsiders. The delta can swallow you. Now, how do we picture the attackers? This is where the Medinet Habu reliefs become almost too influential, because they give us such a vivid image: foreign warriors with distinctive helmets and hairstyles, families and carts, ships with high prows, chaos and capture. It's compelling, and it's also an Egyptian stage-managed story. In the reliefs, the enemy ships look crowded, the Egyptians look organized, and the outcome looks total. But even if we take the broad outline, we can reconstruct a likely scenario. There's pressure on Egypt's borders, maybe raids along the coast, maybe an attempted landing, maybe groups moving through the Sinai approaches. And Egypt responds with a coordinated defense that includes both a land engagement and a river engagement. Most scholars and popular narratives describe it as a combined arms situation, Egypt fighting on land to stop movement toward the heartland, while also intercepting ships in the river mouths or channels. The key is that Egypt doesn't let the fight happen deep inland where the attackers could scatter and live off the land. Egypt tries to kill the problem at the entry points, where movement can be blocked, where the attackers are bunched up, and where Egypt can bring massed firepower to bear. If that sounds like border security doctrine, that's because it is, just in Bronze Age clothing. There's also a psychological element here that I think is really important for the lecture tone. If you're an Egyptian official in this moment, you've heard the rumors, you've seen what happened to other places. You've heard that cities fell, that trade dried up, that allies didn't respond, that the Hittite world is collapsing, that Ugarit is gone. Even if you don't know every detail, you can feel the world shifting. Egypt has long thought of itself as protected by deserts and by the Nile's geography. But the Sea People's story is basically about those protections failing. When danger comes by ship, it bypasses the traditional barriers. So Ramesses III has to project confidence not only to enemies, but to his own system, to the temples, the military, the bureaucracy, the labor forces. He needs them to believe the gods are still with Egypt and the state can still pay and feed and defend. That's why the victory narrative gets carved so big. This is state therapy as much as state history. Now let's get specific about the archers raining fire idea, because people often imagine literal flaming arrows. It might have happened in some cases. Fire can be used on ships, and ancient warfare includes incendiary tactics. But the main killer doesn't need fire. The main killer is volume. An arrow doesn't have to set a ship on fire to be catastrophic. In a packed vessel, one volley can drop multiple men. Even wounded fighters become obstacles. Oarsmen stop rowing. Steering fails. Panic spreads. You lose cohesion. And cohesion is everything in a river battle. Once ships collide and tangle, you've basically created a floating traffic jam of targets.
Then you get boarding actions, capture, drowning, and Egyptian art loves showing the aftermath. Enemies hauled in, bound, counted. Which brings up another very real aspect: prisoners. Egypt is not just defending, it's also capturing people. The reliefs and texts emphasize that the enemy was defeated and their people were settled under Egyptian control, or put to work, or absorbed in various ways. Again, take the imperial spin out of it, and what you see is something interesting. Egypt is not only fighting raiders, it's dealing with migrating groups.
and migration creates a different kind of aftermath than a normal battle. You don't just chase everyone away and go home. You have to decide what to do with families, carts, captives, displaced people. Some get killed, some get enslaved, some get resettled, some get pushed elsewhere, and those decisions shape the next century. So the last stand isn't just heroic combat, it's border management during a regional population crisis. Here's a question people ask a lot. Did Ramesses III save Egypt? In the narrow sense, yeah. Egypt doesn't collapse the way the Hittite state does. The Nile Valley remains Egyptian. The state continues. The temples keep functioning. The pharaoh still has a bureaucracy. But, and it's a big but, Egypt after this is not the same kind of powerhouse it was at its peak. The pressure is costly. Defense is costly. Maintaining the old empire in Canaan is harder. Internal stresses grow. So even a victory can be a sign of decline because it might be the last time you can afford to mobilize at that scale. Think of a boxer who wins a brutal fight but leaves the ring visibly damaged. That's still a win, it's just not a reassuring one. And there's another angle. Egypt's narrative makes it sound like the Sea Peoples were a single wave and Egypt stopped it cleanly. Reality is probably more like multiple waves over time, different groups moving in different directions, some getting deflected, some getting absorbed, some settling elsewhere. The battle is a dramatic high point, but it's not the only interaction. Remember, we already talked about groups like the Shurden appearing as mercenaries in Egypt earlier, so the boundary between enemy and useful foreign soldier is thin. In a crisis, alliances shift fast. One year someone is an invader, the next year their cousins are hired as guards because you need men. That's not hypocrisy, it's survival policy. So what do we take from this chapter? 3 things. First, the Battle of the Delta shows that the Sea Peoples phenomenon isn't a myth. There was genuine maritime pressure, serious enough that Egypt memorialized it as a defining victory. Second, the battle highlights how geography and tactics mattered. The delta's channels, the use of massed archery, the idea of trapping ships, these aren't fantasy. They're plausible, and they fit what a competent state would do when defending a river mouth. And third, the battle is not the end of the story. It's a moment where one state holds the line, but the broader system is still collapsing around it. Even if Egypt wins this fight, the late Bronze Age world of international palaces and smooth trade routes is already in freefall. And that leads us straight into the next chapter, because once you stop seeing the Sea Peoples as just pirates who got beaten, you start asking the uncomfortable question, were these people purely attackers, or were they also refugees, families on the move, driven by the same hunger and instability that broke everyone else? That's where the story gets morally complicated, and honestly, that's where it gets most interesting.
So here's the pivot, and I want to make it gently, because a lot of people come into this topic with a movie in their head. Evil invaders on ships, helmets with horns, cities in flames, the end. And sure, violence happened, ports got hit, people died. But if we stop the story there, we miss what the evidence keeps nudging us toward again and again. At least part of what Egypt calls the Sea Peoples looks less like a raid and more like a relocation. Not just warriors, but whole communities moving under pressure. And once you start seeing that, the whole Bronze Age collapse reads differently. It stops being a simple attack from outside and starts looking like a massive human reshuffling, war, hunger, and migration tangled up together. The first clue is the one that's almost too obvious, and that's why it's powerful. The imagery and some of the descriptions include families, women, children, household goods, ox-drawn carts. That is not what you bring on a fast raid. A raiding party wants speed. It wants to strike and leave. Families and carts slow you down. They also make you vulnerable. So why would you move like that? You move like that when you're not planning to go back, or when going back isn't an option anymore. That's the basic logic of forced migration in any era. People bring what they can carry, they move together for protection, and the fighting age men become both guards and, when they have to, attackers. In other words, warrior and refugee can be the same person depending on the hour of the day. Now, second clue, the timing. We talked about climate stress, harvest instability, and hunger. If you accept even a moderate version of that argument, that multiple regions experienced long stretches of poor harvests and political strain, then large-scale movement becomes not just possible, but likely. When farms fail, people leave. When states can't provide, people leave. When elites squeeze harder, people leave. And the people most likely to leave first are often those on the margins, coastal communities, islanders, groups living in contested borderlands, populations already used to mobility, trade, and seasonal movement. In the Eastern Mediterranean, that's a lot of people. So the Great Migration theory isn't a claim that there was one organized migration event with a single leader and a single destination. It's more like a recognition that the late Bronze Age collapse created refugee flows, and those flows could merge into larger waves, especially when ships and seafaring networks were involved. Third clue, we have hints that some of these groups didn't just attack, they settled. That matters. Settling changes everything. It means you're not just extracting goods, you're taking land, you're building houses, you're bringing a style of pottery, cooking, architecture, maybe even burial practices. And archaeologically, in some places, we do see new cultural packages showing up after the collapse, especially along parts of the southern Levant. We'll talk about the Philistine connection next chapter, but the basic point applies here. Settlement is not just a byproduct of raiding. Settlement is the goal of people who need a home. Now, let's be honest about the emotional difficulty of this. The moment you say refugees, some listeners will reflexively soften the story, like, oh, so they were just innocent victims. That's not what this means. Forced migration is often violent. Sometimes it's violent because people on the move are armed and desperate. Sometimes it's violent because the receiving communities resist them. Sometimes it's violent because the state tries to block them. Sometimes it's violent because different migrating groups clash with each other. The point is not to romanticize. The point is to explain. If a large population is moving through a region in crisis, you should expect raiding, you should expect war, you should expect brutality, and you should also expect human tragedy on a scale that rarely makes it into the royal inscriptions.
The Egyptian version of the story, carved in stone, shows the moment Egypt wins. It does not show the slow hunger that pushes families onto carts. It does not show the arguments around the last stores of grain. It does not show the villages abandoned because the wells went bad. That's not the kind of story states carve on temple walls, but it's likely part of the story we're dealing with. So what might have triggered this kind of movement? There are a few plausible scenarios, and the truth could be a blend. One scenario is climate-driven displacement. Drought pushes people off marginal land in Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant, and they move toward the coasts and then outward. Another is political collapse, when palace centers fall, Mycenaean centers in Greece, Hittite authority in Anatolia, city-states along the coast. The security system breaks and people move because there's no longer a framework to keep them in place. Another is conflict chain reactions. One group moves and pushes on another, like billiard balls. A community fleeing famine or war arrives in someone else's territory, and suddenly that second community is under pressure, and then they move too. That push model is common in steppe migrations later in history, but it can happen in coastal zones too, especially if resources are shrinking. And then there's the piracy mercenary economy angle. In unstable times, armed men can make a living by raiding or by hiring out, and those networks can scale up quickly. If you have enough instability, the line between migrant group protecting itself and raiding coalition looking for supplies becomes thin. You can be both at once. Let's talk about the ox carts again, because they're central. In the Egyptian reliefs, you see carts carrying people and goods. Some scholars interpret those scenes as literal depictions of migrating families. Others point out that Egyptian artists could be using carts as a symbol of these people are uprooted. Fair point. But even if the depiction is partly symbolic, the broader pattern of settlement evidence and the scale of disruption suggests that at least some movement involved whole communities. And from a common sense perspective, it matches what we know about how migration works under extreme stress. Nobody chooses to put their kids on an ox cart and roll into the unknown unless staying put is worse. So what did these migrating groups want? Food, obviously, land, security, a place to rebuild. Ports and river valleys look attractive. Coastal plains look attractive. Anywhere with predictable water and arable land is attractive. Egypt, with the Nile, is the ultimate attractive target in a drought-stressed region, not because it's easy to conquer. Egypt is hard to conquer, but because it looks like it has surplus. That's the magnet effect. And magnets don't care whether the iron filings are good people or bad people. They just pull. Now, this also helps explain something about the Sea People's reputation as unstoppable destroyers. Imagine a coalition of displaced communities. The fighting men are experienced, maybe from mercenary service, maybe from local conflicts, maybe from guarding ships and trade routes.
They're armed, because in a collapsing world you don't travel unarmed. They've lost their homes or their old political order. They have nothing to lose. And they're moving with families, which means they can't afford to be defeated. That combination can create a terrifying opponent, not because they're superhuman, but because desperation is a force multiplier. And if the states they're facing, Ugarit, coastal towns, weakened Hittite vassals, are already underfed and understaffed, then the migrants/raiders can punch above their weight. Now, here's a question we should ask, because it keeps the analysis honest. If they were refugees, why do we see so much destruction? One answer is simple. Mass movement into fortified, resource-rich areas usually causes conflict. Cities defend stores. Migrants need stores. War follows. Another answer is that destruction layers are not always the same thing as annihilation. A city can burn and still have survivors. A palace can collapse and people can keep living in the countryside. Archaeological destruction can mean political collapse, not literal genocide. And in some cases, yes, destruction is intentional. Burning a palace is a way to end a regime, to erase the center of taxation and control. If you're overthrowing a local ruler who can't feed you, burning the palace is a statement. The old order is done. Again, that's ugly, but it's historically common. So the Great Migration theory at its core is really an empathy tool and a systems tool. It forces us to imagine the Sea Peoples not as a monster from the sea, but as human groups responding to a collapsing environment and political order. It doesn't excuse violence. It doesn't deny raids. It doesn't claim everyone was innocent. It just reminds us that mass violence often has upstream causes: hunger, insecurity, the breakdown of authority, cascading failures in supply.
And that brings us to the next chapter, where we narrow in on one group, Peleset, and one region, Canaan, and we watch how migration, settlement, and cultural change can leave footprints that survive long after the battles are over. Because if there's one place where the Sea People's story becomes something more than Egyptian propaganda, it's in the archaeology of the southern Levant, where you can actually see new communities taking root in the ashes of the old Bronze Age world.
Let's do something that historians don't always get to do. Let's follow one name from an Egyptian wall and see if it leaves footprints on the ground. Because with the Sea Peoples, a lot of the time we're stuck inside other people's propaganda, Egypt telling us who the enemy was, in the way Egypt wanted to tell it. But with the Peleset, we may be able to track an actual transition, a group that shows up in Egyptian records as part of that crisis, and then, a little later, a new coastal culture in Canaan that looks different enough to make archaeologists sit up straight. And that coastal culture is what most people know under a later name, the Philistines. So first, the basic identification in plain language. Many scholars connect the Egyptian term Peleset with the later term Philistines. It's not a perfect one-to-one, like you're matching a driver's license photo, but the overlap is strong enough that it's become the standard way to talk about it. Peleset in the Egyptian crisis narratives, Philistines in the early Iron Age southern Levant and in the biblical tradition. And where do the Philistines show up archaeologically? Along the coastal plain of what's now Israel and Gaza, in a cluster of major sites that later texts treat as a kind of Philistine core, places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The 5 cities idea is a later summary, but it's useful as a mental map. You're looking at a compact coastal zone with fertile land, access to ports, and good lines inland. If you're a migrating community looking for a place to settle, that's an attractive strip of real estate. Now, what does the archaeology actually show? Here's the headline that matters. Around the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, you see a cultural shift in parts of this coastal region that is hard to explain as just the same people, but now they like different plates. There's a new style of pottery that appears, often described as Mycenaean-inspired or Aegean style in its early form, and then developing into what archaeologists call Philistine bichrome ware. Translation: the shapes, the decorative patterns, the whole vibe of the ceramics look connected to the Aegean world. Not identical replicas, but close enough to suggest that either people moved, or potters moved, or ideas and tastes moved very fast with people who had status and influence. You also see shifts in foodways at some sites, things like a higher presence of pig bones in certain Philistine contexts compared to many neighboring highland communities. That's not a magic ethnic marker all by itself, but food habits can be sticky, and when you see a cluster of new habits arriving alongside new pottery styles, it starts looking like new communities putting down roots. There are architectural hints too. Different building layouts, different domestic arrangements in some places. Again, not a clean Aegean house dropped onto Canaanite soil, but a pattern of change that lines up with the idea of newcomers mixing into the local landscape. And I want to underline that word, mixing, because this is where people get the story wrong in both directions. One extreme version says, the Philistines were basically Greeks who landed and replaced everyone. That's too simple. The other extreme says it was just trade, no people moved at all. That's also too simple. The more realistic picture is that some number of people with Aegean connections arrived, maybe in groups, maybe in waves, maybe as fragments of larger movements, and they settled among or on top of existing local populations. Over a couple of generations, you get a blended culture. New pottery plus local traditions. new foods plus local agriculture, new identities forming in real time. That's how it usually works. Cultures aren't sealed jars, they're more like soups. Now, this is where modern science has made the conversation sharper and also more sensitive. Ancient DNA. Over the last several years, genetic studies from human remains in Philistine-era contexts, most famously from coastal sites, have suggested that early Iron Age populations in this region include a detectable component of ancestry that looks more at home in the broader Aegean or Southern European sphere than in the local Bronze Age gene pool alone. And the really interesting detail is that this outside signal seems strongest early and then fades as generations pass, which is exactly what you'd expect if a migrant group arrived and then rapidly intermarried with local people. That doesn't mean every Philistine was an immigrant. It doesn't mean the Philistines were Europeans in any modern sense. It means there was likely an influx, real people moving, followed by blending, which honestly is the least dramatic and most historically normal outcome imaginable. So if we tie that back to the Egyptian Peleset, the story starts to click. Egypt describes certain groups as arriving, fighting, and in some cases being settled or pushed into new areas. Meanwhile, on the ground in Canaan's coastal zone, we see a post-collapse society where something new is forming, with material culture that points back across the sea. You don't have to believe in a single giant armada landing all at once to connect those dots. You just have to accept that the collapse created movement, and some of that movement reached the Levant and stuck. Now, where does the Bible come in? The biblical Philistines are, in many ways, the Iron Age neighbors from the coastal plain who become the recurring rivals of the emerging Israelite polities in the highlands. In the stories, the Philistines are city people, organized, sometimes technologically intimidating, sometimes portrayed as culturally other. The famous example is Goliath, of course. But more broadly, you get Philistines showing up as a consistent coastal power. That later literary image is not a direct documentary account of the first arrivals, and it's written with its own political and theological goals. But it probably preserves a real memory of a coastal culture that felt distinct and formidable to its neighbors. And if that coastal culture has roots in a migration event connected to the Sea People's world, then suddenly the biblical Philistines aren't just cartoon villains. They're one of the long shadows cast by the Bronze Age collapse. They're what happens when refugees, fighters, settlers, and locals build a new society in the ruins of an old one. Here's another point that matters for the "who were the Sea Peoples" question. If Peleset becomes part of what we later call Philistine, that suggests the Sea Peoples weren't only a moment of destruction, they were also a creative force, in the neutral sense. They helped reshape populations. They helped reshape cuisines and crafts. They helped reshape political geography. When you look at the Iron Age map, with new small kingdoms, new city-state patterns, different trade routes, part of that world is built by people who arrived during the chaos and then adapted. That's not comforting, but it's real. Collapse destroys, and it also rearranges the pieces into something new. So by the end of this chapter, we've got something like an answer, at least for one thread. The Peleset likely connect to the rise of Philistine culture along the southern Levantine coast, and both archaeology and newer bioarchaeological evidence make it hard to argue this was purely ideas without people. People moved, not in a clean, uniform way, but enough to leave traces. And now we're ready for the next step. Because once you accept that the Sea Peoples phenomenon includes real migration and settlement, the big question becomes, why did the entire late Bronze Age world fall so fast across so many regions?
Because even if migrating groups were part of the pressure, they can't be the whole explanation. The real story, the scary story, is how a complex system can break when multiple stresses hit at once, like dominoes falling in a room that used to feel solid.
So at this point, we've met the faces of the crisis. Letters from Ugarit, the fall of Hattusa, Ramesses III's big defensive moment, migrants who look like both refugees and fighters, and now we have to do the less glamorous thing and ask, why did so many places fail around the same time? Because here's what people get wrong when they treat the Sea Peoples as the whole story. Even a nasty wave of raids doesn't normally erase entire political orders across a whole region unless something else is already broken. A tough enemy can burn a city, but to topple multiple kingdoms, derail trade over huge distances, and knock literacy and bureaucracy down for generations in some areas, that's not one villain. That's a system going unstable. And when a system collapses, it usually doesn't collapse for just one reason. It collapses because a bunch of problems start feeding each other, and suddenly the normal shock absorbers don't work anymore. Think of it like a building that can survive one bad storm, one broken beam, one small fire. But if the storm hits while the fire is burning and the beams are already weakened, the whole structure can pancake fast. That's the domino effect, and the Late Bronze Age is basically a textbook example. Let's lay out the big stressors without pretending we can rank them perfectly. First, climate stress and food insecurity, which we talked about earlier. If harvests are failing or unreliable for decades, you're not just dealing with hungry peasants, you're dealing with budgets, rations, military logistics, tax receipts, and public order. Grain is money in a lot of these societies. Grain is salary. Grain is political legitimacy. If you can't distribute grain, you can't keep your workers, your soldiers, and your administrators loyal. Second, trade disruption. The Bronze Age world is not just trading luxuries for fun. It's trading necessities, especially the inputs for bronze, plus timber, plus specialty goods that elites demand. If the sea lanes become dangerous, or if ports start falling, or if merchant networks stop functioning because too many nodes go dark, then even places that aren't directly attacked feel it quickly. You can be a perfectly peaceful inland city and still be crippled because your metal supply dries up, or your imported grain doesn't arrive, or your diplomatic gifts and obligations can't be met. Third, political instability and internal revolt. This one matters a lot, and it's easy to overlook because it doesn't have a dramatic enemy fleet image. But when states get stressed, the biggest danger often comes from inside, not because people are inherently rebellious, but because the bargain breaks. If the palace can't protect you, can't feed you, and still demands taxes and labor, at some point you stop cooperating. Provincial elites start acting independently, vassals defect, cities decide to fend for themselves, and once a few pieces break away, the center has to spend energy reconquering them, energy it doesn't have. That accelerates collapse. Fourth, earthquakes, what people sometimes call earthquake storms. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault systems, and there's a long-running argument that a cluster of major quakes in this era could have contributed to destruction layers at some sites, weakening urban centers, damaging walls, and creating chaos that made recovery harder. Now, to be fair, archaeologists debate this. Some destruction layers that look like earthquakes could be warfare, and vice versa. And quakes don't explain everything. But here's the part worth keeping. Even occasional big earthquakes in a stressed world can be the final shove. If your granaries are low and your politics are tense, and then an earthquake knocks down part of your walls or your palace, that's not just property damage, that's a legitimacy crisis.
Fifth, the end of palatial coordination. This is the hidden engine.
Palaces in the late Bronze Age aren't just fancy homes for kings, they're administrative brains. They manage labor, storage, redistribution, diplomacy, and often specialized crafts. When the palace falls, burns, gets abandoned, loses its scribes, you don't just lose a building, you lose the ability to coordinate the region. And coordination is what keeps a complex society from fragmenting into smaller local survival units. Once coordination fails, you can't easily rebuild it because rebuilding it requires surplus, security, and skilled administrators. In some places, those disappear for a while. Sixth, migration and raiding. The Sea Peoples phenomenon, plus other movements we'll never have names for. Migration is destabilizing in two ways. It directly pressures resources where people arrive, and it indirectly spreads instability because it clogs routes, sparks conflict, and encourages fortification and militarization. Meanwhile, raiding grows because it becomes a viable economic strategy in a collapsing world. If you can't get paid as a soldier by a state, you raid. If you can't trade safely, you take. And every successful raid encourages more raiding. So these aren't separate causes, they are interacting processes. Here's what the domino effect looks like in motion. A run of dry years hits, harvests fall. The palace demands more from farmers to keep the army fed and the elite stable. Farmers resist or flee. Grain stores shrink. The palace can't pay or supply troops reliably. Garrisons weaken. Banditry rises. Merchants avoid the routes. Coastal ways become more successful. Ports get sacked or shut down. Tin and other key materials stop arriving. Bronze production declines. That weakens military equipment and agricultural tools over time. Meanwhile, vassal states see the center is weak and start breaking away. The center responds by pulling troops from the coast to deal with rebellion inland. The coast is now even more exposed, so more raids succeed, and migration by sea becomes more attractive because defense has thinned. A major city gets hit, Ugarit, for example, and suddenly a whole chunk of the diplomatic and trade network goes offline. Allies don't respond because they can't. Messages don't move because the messengers can't travel safely. Confidence collapses. People hoard. People leave. And then, yes, maybe an earthquake hits a major urban center and knocks it down while it's already on its knees. At that point, the dominoes aren't falling one by one, they're falling in clusters. And the terrifying thing is, from the inside, it probably didn't feel like a neat chain. It felt like everything was happening everywhere, and no one was in charge anymore. This also explains why the collapse is uneven. Some places burn dramatically, some places shrink gradually. Some areas see population move from cities into smaller villages. Some regions become relatively empty for a while. Egypt holds together longer than others, but it retreats from empire. The Levant fractures into new polities. Anatolia breaks into smaller Neo-Hittite states in the south, while the old imperial center disappears. Greece loses palatial bureaucracies and enters a period with less writing and fewer large-scale projects. It's not one synchronized apocalypse button getting pressed, it's a regional system losing its ability to keep itself stable. And once you lose that stability, rebuilding takes a long time because the very tools you need, trade, secure roads, administrative literacy, surplus grain, are the things that collapsed. And that's the real message of the domino effect.
Complexity is powerful, but it's also demanding. It needs maintenance, it needs redundancy, it needs slack. The Late Bronze Age had brilliance, wealth, and impressive coordination, but it didn't have much slack. When the shocks piled up, the system didn't bend, it cracked. And that leads us into the final chapter. Because once you see the Bronze Age collapse as a systems failure, not a single invasion, you can't help but look at your own world a little differently. Not in a lazy, history repeats itself way, but in the more uncomfortable way. What happens to any tightly connected society when multiple stresses line up and the usual fixes stop working? Let me land this plane in a way that feels honest, because it's tempting to end a story like this with fireworks. And the moral is, we're next. That's the easy ending. It's also the lazy ending. The Late Bronze Age collapse is fascinating, partly because it was so specific. Different technologies, different politics, different assumptions about the world. But it's also unsettling because the basic mechanics of failure are familiar. Not identical, familiar. And that's what I want to leave people with. Not a prediction, not a sermon, just a clear picture of what a complex society looks like when it loses its buffers. First, what happened after the collapse? The world didn't end. People didn't vanish. What ended was a particular international order, palace-centered economies, long-distance diplomatic club politics, and trade networks that moved critical materials smoothly across the sea. In many places, big cities shrank or were abandoned. Writing systems became rarer, and the map fractured into smaller, more local powers. But life continued. Farming continued. Crafts continued. People rebuilt in new shapes. Over time, slowly, unevenly, the Mediterranean and Near East reorganized. Iron became more common, new states formed, new identities took root. The Philistines are one example. The emerging kingdoms in the Levant are another. The Neo-Hittite states in parts of Syria and Anatolia are another. It's a reminder that collapse is not extinction. Collapse is reorganization under pain. Second, what do we actually mean when we say the Sea Peoples? If you've listened through these chapters, the answer should feel less like a single identity and more like a phenomenon. The Sea Peoples were not one people. They were a cluster of groups, some raiders, some mercenaries, some migrants with families, moving through a world that was already stressed by hunger, political instability, and failing trade. Egyptian sources give us names and images. Archaeology gives us settlement patterns and cultural shifts. Put together, the best picture we can draw is that the Sea Peoples were both a cause and a symptom. They accelerated collapse in places. They also existed because collapse was already underway. That's not a neat villain story. It's a real history story. Third, why should anyone in 2025 care? Not because history repeats itself like a clock, it doesn't, but because we also live in a world where complexity is a strength and a vulnerability at the same time. We depend on long supply chains. We depend on systems that cross borders. We assume that if one region has a problem, another region will cover it. And most of the time that's true, until multiple shocks line up. The Bronze Age collapse is basically a reminder that systems don't usually die from one hit. They die from stacked hits. Environmental stress, plus political stress, plus disrupted trade, plus violence, plus loss of trust. And trust is a big one. When people stop believing the system will work tomorrow, they change their behavior today, and that can make the breakdown faster. So if there's a warning here, it's not beware mysterious invaders, it's beware fragility you can't see when everything is running smoothly. The Late Bronze Age looked stable right up until it didn't. And finally, I want to end on something small and human, because we started with sails on the horizon and a desk in Ugarit. Imagine the scribe pressing a stylus into clay, trying to make a message travel through a network that is already failing. He doesn't know he's writing a famous artifact. He's just trying to do his job, hoping help arrives, hoping the world stays coherent long enough for the next shipment, the next harvest, the next letter back. That's the Bronze Age apocalypse in one scene, not the mythic end of civilization, but the moment when ordinary people inside a complex system realize the system might not catch them. And that, honestly, is why we're still talking about the Sea Peoples, because the real mystery isn't only who they were. The real mystery is how close a world can be to the edge without realizing it. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.